Welcome to Soul of Travel. I am so excited today to be joined by Ellenore Angelidis, and we crossed paths probably 5 or so years ago, just as you were beginning to create your foundation. And we were actually just talking about scaling and delegating work. And I think that was the conversation we were having way back then. Eleanor was looking for some assistance with growing her foundation and Open Hearts Big Dreams. And I was immediately really connected to your story and your vision and your inspiration to me as someone who is leading women and just helping women to step into their own voice, and now helping communities kind of find their voice and their story. So I'm so grateful to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. And Eleanor and I are collaborating this month for Lotus Communities. And so we have designed a t-shirt that says "She Will Move Mountains." And we will be donating $10 from every one of our shirts, which then also will provide 5 books for their program. And we're going to go a lot more into that as our conversation goes along. But I just wanted our listeners to have that context as we begin this conversation. We're going to talk a lot about literacy and voice and representation. And so I'm so excited to bring all of these things into this conversation today. Eleanor, before we get started, would you just take a moment to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background about Ready, Set, Go books and how this program came to be?
Sure. No, I have a hard time giving a brief background because I've had such a non-linear career and path, but I am a lawyer by training, and I think the best way to describe my path is I followed my curiosity and really looked to maximize impact and learning. So my last corporate career was 13 years as a director at Amazon in both Seattle as well as Luxembourg and France. And the journey to Open Hearts Big Dreams started even before it became an organization 5 years ago. But the biggest literacy project we had started with a friend of mine named Jane Kurtz, and it was titled Ready, Set, Go Books. And it's actually has the bold goal of trying to increase the literacy rate of a country of 115 million, where currently around half the population has not had the opportunity to learn to read.
That is a big, bold goal. But I have loved seeing how much impact you have already been able to create in the last, I think it's been about 5 years. Is that right? Since you launched?
5 years, yes, we had our 5-year anniversary, paper anniversary, because if you know anything about founding not-for-profits, the first step, the first year or so is paperwork, lots and lots of paperwork.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that. And I really wanted to talk about the importance and the impact of literacy. I think it's one of those things that is a small thing that really has a profound impact, and something that, coming from the US, isn't something that is really, it's not really easily understood what that access to reading, or inaccess to reading, even looks like, because it's obviously so much more available. And then what not being able to read or write or communicate with that form, how that creates inabilities. And really, that if you don't learn to read, and this is something you said to me, if you don't learn to read, every door is shut. So what does opening that door mean to the communities that you're working with?
And I want to be a quick clarifies. You have lots of opportunities to contribute and have impact, but you don't have educational opportunities. Every educational opportunity is closed if you don't know how to read. Yes. And I think the best way to answer that question, Christine, is to give an example of one of our team members. His name is Dr. Worku Mulat. He has a PhD in ecology, and he comes from a family that had never had the opportunity to read before he and his siblings. And his mother, who is illiterate, but a community leader. And that's why I want to be very careful to say you can have a huge positive impact. It's
Mhm.
just there's a lot of opportunities that are not going to be available to you. And she decided for all of her children that she wanted them to just learn to read and write, just learn to read and write, an opportunity she didn't have. And what Dr. Worku shared with me is once I learned to read, I couldn't stop, right? It just propelled me forward. I saw possibilities. I learned things. It opened all these doors. And he's the oldest, and all of his siblings have advanced degrees. A number of them work for Microsoft as engineers. So that one door opening just created so many opportunities. And then that family is now impacting so many others through the work that they're doing. So the literacy has these ripples that happen both for the individual, the family, the community. And if you think about it, literacy allows people to participate in their communities, right? To know what's happening around them, the news, what they hear, being able to think critically. And those opportunities are just not available to way too many in Ethiopia. So that was something where we felt we had something we could contribute.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for the clarification, because certainly not what I meant, but the kind of more traditional, I guess, roles that do hinge on certain levels of education is where it's harder to create those pathways if you don't have the opportunity to have learned to read. And as you were talking about that story, I was just being reminded of my daughter's learning to read and how magical it is watching that journey, and how much access to knowledge that books do give you. And especially in some areas where maybe you don't have access to universities or certain types of education. And I'm even thinking about where I grew up in rural Montana, where, you might have, I was kind of a book nerd, and I was really frustrated that we didn't have all of these science classes. But because we had a good library, I just did independent study and taught myself the science I wanted to learn. Or, my kids now can quote all these things about whatever is really interesting to them because they grabbed a book and they chose, to spend their time reading about that and learning about that. And so I think for me, books have always just been these magical portals to wherever you want to be and whatever you want to do. And so I love that it's something as simple as giving someone the tool to understand what is in all of these books really allows them to like blossom into that next version of themselves.
Exactly. I mean, my trips to the library, we grew up, we didn't have a lot, but going to the library, it felt like you could travel anywhere you wanted to. You could be anyone you wanted to be. And when we first brought home Layla and we sort of learned the disparity in opportunity for the average kid who would grow up in the US or the average kid who would grow up, in Ethiopia, it was sort of hard to even wrap your mind around. One thing I do with some of our, young volunteers is I get them together in a group and I ask them to raise their hand if they know how to read. And everybody raises their hand. And I said, half of you put your hand down, right? Like, so now that's half the population. What if half of you couldn't read? And then the second question, which is also like hard to imagine given what we see every day, how many of you learn to read with books? Because actually the kids that learn to read in Ethiopia often do not have children's books. They're learning to memorize an alphabet, and then they're learning to read maybe a street sign or a store sign, or if someone has a Bible at home, or you mentioned a textbook. So it's not creating that love of reading and that introduction to imagination and play, and that we expect from learning to read, because learning to read in our minds is coupled with an abundance of colorful, engaging, representative books, right? So if you take those two things away, and I've had young people come back and say, I didn't know, right? Like I can't even get my head around that, right? And I think that's what really drove us is we take this literally for granted, that there are that you learn to read, and that there's just as many books and even more as you could possibly want. And that's not true for everybody.
Yeah, and I know when I was researching the work you do and reading that 50% of people that learn to read aren't using books, I couldn't even imagine how you would learn to read without a book. Like, I mean, this is our context for learning to read, right? I just had no ability to even understand, like, I mean, yes, you could learn the alphabet, you can write it, but then where do you go? How do you put that into practice? So that awareness of street signs and store signs and kind of whatever you can get your hands on to practice that tool, but then also thinking about how much time I have spent. Again, I have young kids, with them learning to read. So if you don't have that like kind of constant exposure and that continued development, even if you have this basic understanding, like you said, it doesn't become like this leisurely process. It's kind of more this tedious, frustrating, um, maybe hard to understand thing that you don't just kind of, you don't do it in your free time. You don't do it like, my one daughter walks around like this. She's that kid, right? Like you're like, please put the book down and just pay attention for a second. And you don't get the space maybe for that to become a part of your daily life.
Exactly. So what we actually have said is we're interested in teaching a love of reading, right? That reading isn't a chore. And some of the recent studies have shown even where literacy rates have increased, the reading comprehension has not. And it makes sense to me. If you haven't learned to love to read, you're not embracing it, and it's not taking you on the journey that we described. And seeing our books with kids in Ethiopia, you see kids literally, like that your description of your daughter, we have a picture, and we have more than one, of literally children almost disappearing in the books because they're literally trying to get so close to the pictures and so close to the language and following it along because they want that story to come. And we find parents now are empowered because even if you don't know how to read, our stories are simple. The illustrations are doing a lot of the heavy lifting and telling the story. So we actually have a program in the very, very south of Maji that we're working with another organization where it's read to mom. So what if the mom doesn't know how to read? You described helping your child. How do you help your child if you don't know? But if your child is learning, maybe they can help you, and you can together learn how to read, or at least have this shared educational experience, because we know parental involvement of any kind is going to help that child be more successful and also increase the confidence of the mom or the dad that feels like they can't help their child in school because they didn't get that opportunity. So the amazing multi-generational and community ripples and the pride. Like, I remember one little boy coming in with a book and he's pointing, that's me, right, in the book. And because he saw himself, right? And whether it was exactly him, I don't know that the author knew him, but that sense that I see myself, I see my community, I see things that are familiar to me, that was another part, that these are culturally appropriate, designed for the kids who will ultimately read them.
Yeah, I love that. And for me, again, this was not a new awareness, but just kind of like taking me back to a moment when I realized, when you look at stories in the US, that even our literature is not really culturally representative of a vast majority of our population. And, you look at this across the board in media. So when you are traveling, so I often love to sit and read with children when I'm traveling as well. And I remember being in Guatemala and reading stories, and again, kind of having that aha moment of like, well, these stories are great and the kids are enjoying them, but what would it mean to them if they saw themselves in these books? If they really didn't feel like reading in a way is almost even more foreign when you are reading these books about people that they maybe are never exposed to outside of a few travelers. And I just was kind of trying to understand what that would feel like in my mind, to try to, if every book that I had ever seen growing up depicted Asian families, and I was trying to find myself in that situation, like I just was trying to flip the roles, you know what I mean? And see like how does your sense of identity become established when you are even learning to read in a setting that looks and feels like that? And it just created some interesting dialogue in my family about what representation is and how important that might be in books. But you kind of mentioned it, but how does that help? And I know you have books that are also focusing on kids with disabilities and as well to kind of fold in that or expand on that, seeing yourselves in books.
Representation is a concept that is so big and so simple all at the same time. When you see yourself represented, you feel valued, you feel seen, you feel like you matter. And I think even my daughter, who is growing up in the US, there's not as many kids that look like her as might look like me. There's not as many books with characters who look like her versus look like me. And we're finding that our books are doing a whole lot of representation globally, which is really amazing because we have this target audience and this target goal. But I think when you do something that involves stories and involves honoring, you know, cultures and history and trying to actually capture something, the ripples go out in so many places. Like we know we have digital and physical books that are used to support Somali and Eritrean refugees in the Scandinavian countries of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. We have all of our books in all of our language is in the Seattle Public Library, a large selection in the Denver Public Library, and a number of the California public libraries. And what we were told is this is language and culture preservation for some of the library patrons. It's Black history that predates, you know, the US history that where Black history has focused. And it's also for others an opportunity to learn about a culture that is not theirs, right? That they don't get the same opportunity to learn about as maybe a European culture. Mm-hmm. And because they're bilingual, the access is opened up to so many more. So we're finding that representation actually is representing many different people, but in country, we know that the research shows you have to learn in your mother tongue. So in whatever language is being spoken in your home, for literacy to be effective, you need to learn in that language first, and then you can learn others. You need to learn with simple, colorful, engaging books that represent your community. That is what is going to draw a child in. And that's what's going to make them feel like this book is about me. This book is about my family or my country or my culture or my continent. But I'm not confused by seeing people in a book that don't look like any people I see on a regular basis. And again, your description of what would that look like, I don't think any of us can even come close to imagining that, because our normal is that we get represented all the time. We get all those messages that we matter, we're seen. Now there's places where as a woman, you don't get that message, right? And then I find as a woman, I can see where I am represented and I can see very clearly where I'm not. And that's the best analogy that allowed me to see what does it feel like when I don't see myself represented, when I see the top general counsels, right, as a lawyer, or when I see the CEOs, or when I see, you know, the heads of government, and I don't see a lot of representation of people who look like me. How does that make me feel? And I can then take that to say, I can only imagine what it's like on an exponential level if you don't see representation at all at really basic levels.
Yeah, thank you so much for walking us through that, because I think that's something that will be really important for our listeners, because it also really it plays both into this situation with literacy, but also with why travel is so important, engaging in other cultures, and like that space it creates for you to engage with another culture and then reflect on your own, and seeing these different things side by side are what help to open and grow our vision. So I love thinking about it, and just I guess kind of trying to put myself into that place that feels a little uncomfortable so that I can try to relate and then see what action comes out of that awareness. You have mentioned a couple times your daughter, and I really meant to start here with a broader introduction to this program, and I just got so excited to start diving into these topics that we really just went headlong in. But you mentioned your daughter Layla. She was born in Ethiopia, and that some of this project was prompted by her experience, and then much of how it's developed has also been really led by her personal drive to and her personal curiosities and questions she's posed in your life. But I just wanted to give you time to maybe share a little bit more about the background, and then how the idea for dual language books, which we also kind of just skipped over, but is really important, a little bit more of the foundation of this of your business or of this organization and the people that you're serving.
No, that's perfect. So I joke sometimes, but most joking has a pretty big kernel of truth in it, that this is a mom project, and a sort of like an equity project for me. And that the mom project is, my youngest child is adopted from Ethiopia. She came home as a 6-month-old. And one of the questions we got, which we talked about, was what would her life have been like, which frankly, there's no way of knowing, but we started to dig into what are the differences as we wanted to connect our daughter to her first culture and her first country. And it became very clear that the opportunities for a kid born in her country versus born in the US on average was very, very different. And that's why one of the things you'll see on our website is we don't think kids' dreams should be impacted by where in the world they were born, that everyone should have big dreams. And literacy obviously is a big part of it. So we started by building a library in her birth town and traveling back. So traveling is really, really important to me. I am the child of immigrants. So my mother is from the Netherlands. My dad actually grew up in Indonesia and Australia, although he's also Dutch. So he is a wanderer. He was a wanderer. He is now in another world. But that love of travel was a big part of what started us on this. And when we traveled to Africa, it opened a whole nother world that we only understood from the books, right? And only a little, to be really honest. And I'm actually a little embarrassed that I didn't know more at the very beginning. But it started us on this journey, and Layla was always part of it, right? Because Layla has a very strong sense of equity. And when she was really little, and I told her, some kids in your country, birth country, don't get to go to school, and some kids don't get to learn to read. Her response was immediate and very pointed to me. Mama, that's not fair. You need to fix it. Because kids believe everything is fixable by adults, and adults sometimes forget that there's a lot you can do. Maybe you can't fix it, but if you do nothing, you certainly won't fix it. So that got us started. And then at about 5 years ago, I sort of took a pause because we'd been doing a lot of fundraising and working with other organizations, and the literacy rate hadn't moved. And I really felt like I needed to be doing something different, right? That my goals were to have impact, and different people, different goals. The organization we worked with, we still collaborate with, we love what they do, but I wanted to see some of this tangible impact. And I saw these opportunities, bigger opportunities, that weren't structured in a way that they would fit with any traditional NGO that I could find out there. Because I had a friend who advised me, if you can find a way not to start an NGO, don't, right? And so I could not find a way not to start an NGO. So the goal was really to look for these big in-between projects so we could support other NGOs. Because another piece of advice I got that was really impactful was, don't be another NGO, small little NGO working in Ethiopia. There's so many. Do something that has a big impact, which again resonated with me. And I thought, okay, how do we help everybody else, right? So everybody's got all these challenges. I'd seen them by collaborating with some of them. So we really said, we're going to focus on literacy, technology, innovation, inclusion is a new focus, and leadership. And then I looked for the projects. So I just knew I was going to do something in literacy. I didn't really know what it was. And I met up with my friend who had actually was one of the co-founders of the first organization I worked with. And she had this what was then a little project of these bilingual books, because she's an award-winning children's author. She's from Portland, but she had grown up in the south of Ethiopia. Her name is Jane Kurtz. She's written all kinds of books for Simon & Schuster, Penguin, others. And she had basically this pilot that her and her sister were working on. And I said, that's the literacy project. Like, we need to make that so much bigger. And I was in a role at Kindle Direct Publishing, so the timing was absolutely perfect. And I said, what would it take to impact literacy? And she said, probably we have to create enough books for a small library, like the size of a small children's library. So we estimated 200 unique titles, and then Ethiopia has 90 languages, but we figured if we got the top 3, we would hit roughly 70 to 80% of the population. So that was our initial goal. And we're at 115, we might hit 130 by the end of the year. And we actually we have between 4 and 7 languages, not all of the books, but that's kind of where it started, and it kind of took us on a crazy journey. And for Layla, she's fundraised for us. She's a children's book author for us. She's been a spokesperson for us. And a big part for me was that this was something we do together. Like, this was something I wanted her to lead. Her voice is very important, and we collaborate with the community in everything we do. But Layla in our family represents the community, and we wanted to make sure that as we were doing things, it was creating that additional connection and understanding and ability to contribute to where she came from.
Thank you so much for offering that more clear understanding, because I think there was so many things in there that really are really important to think about. And I love that your daughter has that drive. We've talked before, my oldest daughter, that's the lens she sees the world through as well. Like, I remember sitting in the car with her like 4 or so years ago, and somehow we talked about, people, not all people having jobs or people being homeless. And then she was like, her mind started like trying to solve homelessness, right? Like, immediately. Right. She's like, of course, this is not okay. This is not acceptable. What do we do? And she says, and she didn't really know, this is something we hadn't talked about prior, but she said, well, there should be places where people who don't have enough money to buy food can go and just get the food they need for themselves and their families. And it should just be free, and there should be lots of things there. And I said, well, they do have those. Those are called food banks. She's like, okay, great. I want to work at one. She's like, oh, wait, is that at the grocery store? Sometimes we buy stuff and we put it in the big boxes. I was like, yeah, that's that. And then she's like, well, now what about if they don't have homes? How are they going to cook this food? They need a place where they can go and they can sleep and they can prepare a meal and their families can have, security. And so she's just like going right down the path of how do we solve, homelessness in our country. And like, it's so amazing to see how their minds work and actually how like broad thinking they can be. And I think for me, there's so much magic in being in that space where you kind of haven't become jaded as an adult, where you just assume that this is completely tangible, right? And we also talked about this, and maybe we can spend a little time here, is like, for others who are listening who have children that have this similar drive and passion and determination, who I know will do great things, how do we create a space for them and give them support so that they can continue on this path and that they don't kind of continually come up against roadblocks because of their age or their gender or inadequate funds that then just make them be disillusioned and they are no longer wish to be these like global powerhouses?
Well, I'm going to actually borrow from one of my heroes to answer that question. I had the amazing good fortune to meet Jane Goodall when we were living in Paris with one of my children. I felt like she much more enjoyed talking to the children than the adults, which I cannot blame anyone for. But one of the things she said, of all the things that worried her in the world, and there's obviously so many things, she was doing a world tour at 80. I would like to be doing half of what she was doing at that age. So she was role modeling in so many ways, so many important lessons. But she said the only thing that she really worried about was young people losing hope. Mm. And I thought that was so profound, and it's sort of hidden in the question you just asked. How do you keep young people hopeful so they keep looking for solutions? And then I just saw a quote from Jane Goodall, I think it was yesterday, that someone shared on social media. If you want to find a solution to a hard problem and you're committed to finding it, you will make progress. And I feel like that model of starting with hope and then really helping your child see how they can contribute, even as there's obstacles. Like Layla and I talk about, like, some of the things we did work, some of them didn't. In the early days, we had one translation that got not very positive feedback. We had to pull all those books back, start over, find a different process. We thought we would make this trip in 2019 and then get all this, big funding from large organizations. That didn't happen, and we ended up getting funding through very different sources. So sharing the journey and giving them tools, that things that you would do in other environments, like experiment, try and experiment, collaborate. Who else wants to do what you're doing, right? And what we found is our collaboration base has just been absolutely amazing, of people who literally appear. Mm-hmm. I still want to believe in magic, but like drop out of wherever when you need them for a part of the project. And I think letting them see that as you put things out there and as you follow your own values and your energy, and you're open to feedback on what's working and what's not, you will learn, which is always a win. And making progress is something that you have to define what it looks like before you can know what it is. And I think starting with that as a child, like, make sure they're hopeful, give them projects, and then help them work through the disappointments or failures, because frankly, I don't know anyone who life has been a straight line and only success. If there's someone out there, maybe we could meet them. But for me, it's all about managing the bumps, right? And managing the detours.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Man, speaking of magic, that was just a random thought that I had. And I think that was really, really valuable. So thank you so much. Yeah, I think just across the board, that's something that I feel like my daughter's generation has the hurdles of not knowing how to overcome roadblocks, because it seems that we try to remove them for them as much as possible. And I actually, decided we need to just leave those in there and maybe even create some so that they can develop those skills for overcoming that disappointment and the frustration. And it's really hard in the moment, but knowing that the next time, then they have something to call on, and they have this tool that they can use to navigate that disappointment or that frustration, or to know that they can get through and get to the other side of it and try again without it being this just like full stop. So I think that's also really important and a really valuable lesson. And it's harder sometimes to do it with something you're so engaged in from the heart, because it means something different. Where if it's a paper you got a bad grade on, but you didn't really care too much about the paper, it's not as poignant or as painful as something that really means something as much as this must for you and your daughter.
For sure. I mean, one of the things I do in my, professional life is I do some public speaking, and I put together a talk that was called Failing My Way to Success, which was probably one of the most uncomfortable talks I ever prepared and delivered. And I rethought my decision to even offer that many, many times through the process. But one thing that came out, which was something I knew, and I think most people know intuitively, we're just getting so much messaging that tells us the opposite. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is a key input to success. So in order to succeed, you have to fail. So that is one of the most valuable things I think you can teach your children, is that failure is an input. I think the other thing you mentioned is when you are so emotionally attached to things, it's easy to get too close to something where you can't see other possibilities. And I think one of the things that I've learned more recently, and with COVID and, you know, things that just aren't possible now in the world as it is sometimes when you let go of holding something so closely, a new opportunity opens. Something else reveals itself because you created a little bit of space and a little opening and a little light. And all of a sudden you realize, I was trying to get through this door, which is closed. But because I was so close to the door, I didn't see there actually is a side door over here that I could go through. And I had a funny negotiation one, which shows like pictures of a sheep, right? And sheep they're literally at a gate and they're trying to get through the gate. There's no fence. There's just the one gate. And they're stuck because they can't back up and go around. They're just stuck. And I think we often are those sheep. We just think there's this one way through and we can't get there. And then we're frustrated, as opposed to saying, whoa, maybe an over, around, and through strategy might work. So I think both looking for that distance and that space to allow things to reveal themselves, and also just remembering failure is an input to success, not the opposite, I think are two valuable things that I've sort of hung on to when you hit those speed bumps or disappointments or detours.
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and that just reminded me of that as well, is that we also get really comfortable with just like being stuck at that gate. And regardless, if we then like look and we're like, oh, I could just go that way. It's like, here we know where we are, right? And if we start to go that way, we're stepping into the unknown. And so even though it gets us maybe unstuck, we're more fearful of what could happen, and whether it's success or failure or just like 5 other options, we sometimes just stay in this stagnant space because it's known and comfortable. So I think that's probably something that might resonate to people that are listening as well.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that I guess, pivot or pit stop in this conversation, because I think that that's so valuable. I did want to talk a little bit about the how literacy intersects with gender empowerment. That's something that is a really important topic to myself, and part of why the slogan on our community is "She Will Move Mountains." What does it look like for young girls that are learning to read, and what's the I guess the impact specifically for that that you have seen, or in general that you're aware of?
So there's a lot to unpack in that question, Christine, because I think gender is one of the things where it's a global phenomenon where women and girls do not have the same opportunities, and it doesn't matter where in the world you go. And this I learned as I did my research as Amazon's first executive who led diversity functions and really spent a lot of time in the research. So the other piece that I think is really important when you connect it to literacy is, I gave you the literacy numbers for the country. You know, it's around half. It's significantly worse for girls and young women and women generally. And when you look at stats globally, when there's a challenge in a country, many times it's worse. If not everyone's getting educated, like who's getting educated? And if you look at a level deeper, and that really struck me. So what we wanted to do is kind of tip the scales to be more equal. So we really focused on making sure girls are represented in our books, but girls are also represented in many powerful ways in roles as the smart girl, or roles where they can dream anything they want to be, the same message you might tell a little boy, and really working to help that little girl not only get the power of being able to read in her toolkit for the future, but getting the power of seeing herself, imagining herself as the heroine, as the person who becomes, you know, whatever it is that she sees as her big dream. Because I think the challenge is, if you don't have representation, you don't have the tools, and you don't see people that look like you doing the things you think you could do with the right opportunity, you don't even imagine it. So part of what literacy does is it allows young girls to imagine something different and then have the tools that can start them on their journey. So we both do that with the literacy. We also right now are running virtual computer science and leadership camps, and our focus is to make sure those we have as close to equal representation of young men and young women, again, to try and create the leadership of the future to be more representative of the population. But it's a challenge, and it's a challenge we haven't fully addressed in the US. I think as a woman here, most of us can say no, it hasn't been fully addressed, but I think there's some levels of challenges when you go into places where literacy is still a significant issue, that the impact on women and girls is even more stark. And so the importance of it to them is even greater.
Yeah. I actually like to keep coming back to home, but because I have 3 daughters, a lot of this is so relevant. But one of my daughters was really concerned like the last week, and I said, "Can you name what this feeling is?" And she was like, "I'm just really sad because I feel like I'm more like a boy than a girl." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And she's like, "All of my interests are boy interests, and I just don't know that I can do any of them." I like, and she's like, she loves coding, she loves science, she loves math, she wants to be an astronaut. She's like, and she said, she's like, "I don't think I can do any of those things. I don't think any women do those things." And it made me think, like, who's she seeing doing those things? And so it does hit hard that there's still a lot of work to do. Universally, it's a global issue, like you said, and you know, really trying to paint this picture that young girls can see themselves stepping into any of these roles that they aspire to, and especially when someone has a natural inclination towards something, right? Like that's a gift that was given, and so you don't want to discourage that or make them feel that it's not a possibility because of their gender. And yeah, it just really, that really hits home for me as well, to put myself in her shoes and think about that for a moment.
For sure. And I think you mentioned inclusion earlier. I mean, the gentleman who inspired our inclusion project ended up in a wheelchair after an accident as a young person and looked for role models for his new life. And he found it very hard, and he wrote about it, to find any other than some unbelievably extraordinary humans that were like mountain climbing in wheelchairs. And he joked in the piece that he wrote that he really loved seeing that, but he sort of wanted a few more normal people, right, doing, you know, everyday life. And then he actually concluded the piece, and unfortunately he left this world too soon, but he concluded the piece that at the end of the day, he realized he became the role model for others that he never got for himself. And what we also realized as we looked at our books is we neglected to represent those children. And again, partly because no one on the team had that lived experience. We had been very careful on gender, socioeconomic, religious, region, like all kinds of elements of inclusion. But if you don't have a lived experience or someone that reminds you, we realized we'd created a whole lot of books without one kid that had a different ability. So it was, sometimes it takes that light. And I talked to a couple of the literacy folks on our team, and I said, I was embarrassed, truly embarrassed, because here I'm trying to be fully inclusive, and I've literally not been inclusive for a very significant population. And she had exactly the same reaction. So I think part of it is that awakening, and also making sure that we have representation all over so that we don't have to remember for everyone or remind people. And I think those going together of making sure that you act on your aha moments, like the moment with your daughter, and where do you go from there? And then realize the more we have representation everywhere, the less those aha moments will be needed.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think this kind of goes into a conversation I've had with some people about those awarenesses and that moment of discomfort when, like you said, when you realize that you've been doing it wrong, and wrong's not the right word, but that the version of you that didn't have that awareness, that was the way you knew how to do it, right? But a lot of people, they kind of can't get past that moment and move forward because it's almost acknowledging the you that didn't do it right in the first place, right? It's like easier to stay without acknowledging that so that you don't have to say, I did it wrong, now I'm doing it right. It's just like, oh, I'm just staying and kind of behind the gate again, right? And so I think that maybe that's where, especially on these conversations that are so culturally entrenched, um, it's just really difficult to take that first step and admit that you didn't know everything that you didn't know, which is really beautiful, right? That's where you get to move forward, but it's also really hard and difficult for some people to be able to take that step.
Yeah, I like Maya Angelou's quote, do the best you can, and when you know better, do better. And that
Mhm.
really released me from the guilt if I didn't know. And maybe I should have known, and I can have guilt about that. But once you know, then you're now accountable for the choices you make after that. And I think that quote has helped me very much in this work when you come to that uncomfortable realization and then have a choice. What do
Mhm.
I do with it? Do I just sit with it? Do I reject it, or do I take it on board and do better?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Um, well, I have just loved so much going deeper and learning more about you and learning more about why this mission is so important. Before we wrap up our conversation, I want, if there's anything else that we missed that you wanted to share, I want to create the space for that. But I also want to make sure we let people know how they can get involved. And one of the really fun ways you had mentioned to me was your YouTube channel, where people can read books to help increase awareness and literacy. So I'd love for you to share about that, but then any other ways that they can be engaged and support you.
No, that's awesome. One, just buying our books or letting your community library, school, let them know these books are available, because every book that gets purchased outside of Africa funds books within Africa. And we're currently actually working on some projects to get books to displaced children, kids that are displaced because of conflict or COVID and can't even get to a school. So how do we get books to them? So this project will help us do more of that. And then, as Christine mentioned, when COVID hit, we had to sort of reinvent like everyone else. And we knew kids were at home, and we had volunteers, and it can be kids. Kids love watching other kids read, but essentially it's just creating a video on your phone of you reading a book, hopefully holding the book up in whatever language you have. If English is your first language, that is perfect. And just reading the book, and a kid somewhere in the world can watch YouTube and learn about that particular story. And we're happy to send you a book, and we love to share what we do. And we're always open to new ideas and new projects. So we also love hearing if you have something you want to do. One area of expansion for us that I don't know that even Christine and I have talked much about is we're adding more languages, because we've gotten feedback that, what about Kiswahili? What about French? There's all these other African languages that if you had them, we could serve more countries and more children. So we're actually in that process. So there's lots of different opportunities, and we're just excited to have some of you reach out and join the team.
Yeah. And I would really encourage anybody who, like, if this was your aha moment or something within you just ignited, to reach out, because sometimes we don't even know what door is open, but that I think that connection is really important. And so I just invite anybody listening to do that. And I love that the opportunity to bring this to even more languages is around the corner, because that was one of my favorite and most kind of aha moments traveling in Africa, is how many languages you pass through within, you know, days, hours, minutes. Like there's an amazing amount of languages. And so the ability to be able to create these books to serve as many people as possible, I think is really great. And then you also mentioned um, people being able to purchase the books. I don't know if we said that they can purchase them on Amazon. And I think even for local libraries, I know when I was in Africa, I bought a bunch of books for my kids because I loved hearing the local traditional kind of tales. It's a chance for them to get to experience a culture that they haven't interacted and engaged with. So beyond serving a need for literacy in Ethiopia, like allowing for children in the United States or UK or wherever you're listening to be able to read these books and share that knowledge and awareness and expand it that way, I think is really a really neat tool to be able to use them that way as well.
Yeah, I think Layla would put a plug in for Layla and I collaborate on some of the books. Some of them are true stories, but our latest is the story of Andromeda, an Ethiopian princess. So if you didn't know that Andromeda was Ethiopian, there you know. And my husband is Greek, so it was a beautiful connection between the Greek and the Ethiopian. And it has a science element in the end, because if you study, astronomy, Andromeda is a constellation. So we actually had a fun interaction where some families in Greece who have children from Ethiopia, they actually are translating the English into Greek so that their children can have the Greek Amharic version. And that has been a really fun, popular one. And also a reclaiming story, because for better or for worse, most people represent Andromeda as someone who looks more like us than her true Ethiopian heritage. So a fun book if you want to try us out. One other thing I'd love to mention, if you have any creative people listening, we're always looking for new illustrators. All of our illustrators and writers are volunteers, but we know that if it is a calling for you, it is a gift that gives back. I have an illustrator friend who's going through a health crisis, and I sent her a picture of one of her books being enjoyed somewhere in rural Ethiopia, and she said it lifted me up, that my art could have purpose, that my art could be used in this way. So if you have that in your skill set, we would welcome you to either think through an illustration or illustrating a book or whatever works for you.
Thank you. And I love, and again, I think I'm probably quoting yourself back to you, but that stories are what connect us and really help us to feel something and create global understanding. So that example of Andromeda, like really exemplifies that, right? Like there's just this way to connect all these pieces and stories and parts together, and to really begin to see that every story is our story, like universally. And so this project is something that really resonates for me from that space of reading and magic and connection and global understanding. So I really appreciate the work you're doing. And I'm really grateful that you spent this time with me today for this conversation.
No, I love it. And I learned a little bit about Pan-Africanism, which is the notion that Africa has a shared history and a shared destiny. And I've chosen, because I can't quite own that one, that as a human race, we have a shared history and a shared destiny. And that if our science is correct, we actually are all from Ethiopia originally. And so these books are actually everyone's history and are there for everyone. And that is part of what brings a huge amount of joy to me, that we can be a part of connecting the human race in ways that they might not have thought about or seen possible before.
Thank you. Well, Eleanor, I really appreciate this. And for anyone listening, I just really encourage you to take a look at Open Hearts Dream Big and the Ready, Set, Go books, because they're really, really inspiring, and I think really far reaching and really for everybody. So I am so excited to see who this resonates with and what doors open from this conversation.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.